in terms of foreign policy and geopolitics. Since the Arugula began, and since we started scrambling around for dollars, as it were, I think we redress the balance or the perception of the imbalance in our foreign policy from China to India. And that, of course, has its own repercussions and long-term consequences. The purpose of this panel discussion was to try to see whether we can tie all of these elements together, because there is a tendency to look at this as an economic crisis, to look at it as a political crisis, to look at it indeed even as a human rights crisis, but not to tie all the three together. And we at CPA have always maintained that this is a crisis of governance. It is about misgovernance, bad governance, or indeed lack of governance, as the case might be, that has cumulatively built up since independence in 1948. And in that sense, that is the breadth of the challenge that we face. It's not something to which we can apply a theoretical formula or a technical formula. It is something that also requires, I think, changing the mindset of the people of this country with regard to what they can and should expect from government. It is about a redesigning of the social contract in Sri Lanka, apart from the immediate question of getting ourselves out of the difficulty of no dollars, no money for X and Y and Z. It is a much more deep-rooted thing. And as, of course, the cliche goes, in every sort of misfortune, there is a glimmer of hope, a silver lining in every cloud, and we should seize upon this to try to come up with a new paradigm of governance and a new architecture for this country in terms of how we deal with our minorities, our disadvantaged, our poor, how we deal with the question of representation in democracy, how we deal with human rights, and indeed, how we deal with the question of subsidies. What is the responsibility of government to the population in general? Is it the case that at one level, we are indeed looked after from cradle to grave by government? We have, what, 1.5 million public servants for 22 million people. And we all know we can do with a quarter of that amount, or even less. You know. So these are all questions, I think, that we have to come to address, and we have to address it in a coherent, cogent fashion. We need a government that will communicate to the people as to why we have got to where we have got, what we have to do to get out of it, and what it is doing to get out of it. We need that because we need the country to be, in effect, reconciled and united to deal with the challenges ahead. There are going to be, at one level, winners and losers if we are going to get out of this. But we have to do it with the least amount of recrimination and division. And therefore, we need a holistic perspective as to what the situation is. So hopefully, we can shed some light on this and begin to come up with that perspective in terms of how we get out of this current situation. So let me hand over to Bhavani to introduce the speakers and to moderate the panel discussion. Do I keep this on? Oh, you have that then. Okay.
Is it working? Welcome everyone, and thank you for coming and braving the rains. We have having this event today, considering the last week's events in terms of what happened in Geneva with the adoption of the resolution at the UN Human Rights Council. And we also thought internally it's very important to have a conversation as to what the resolution means, but also in terms of what's happening in Sri Lanka in terms of the other processes, and in a context of an unprecedented economic crisis, and where we saw many people, thousands coming to the streets, demanding system change. We've seen much development in Sri Lanka in the last few months, but also in terms of the present situation in the country. Now, I thought before we go into the panel, it will be very important to speak about why this resolution is important, and looking at it in terms of Sri Lanka's own history in the council, because many, I think, are unaware as to why are we in the council, what does it mean, and we have a short leaflet a couple of my colleagues did in terms of what the resolution means, but also in terms of addressing some myths, some misconceptions, and we'll go into some of those as well in terms of the narratives, the different narratives that are created in light of the international processes and how that's also manipulated to some extent by different actors. So just in terms of the council and where we are, for many of you who followed it, it's very, I think we don't need to go into it, but some people in the room may not be aware. Sri Lanka has been on the agenda of the Human Rights Council for now 10 years. So the first resolution was in 2012, and that resolution was very much urging the government to take particular steps. Now, why I go back to it is because sometimes there is this notion that this is a new process. It's not a new process. Under successive governments, we have seen various promises made, and I was actually looking at the different resolutions since 2012. The language is very similar. It refers to domestic processes of the various governments. Several times the Lessons Learned and Reconciliation Commission is mentioned. We have discussions of the human rights violations, of land grabs, of impunity, lack of progress with the various domestic processes, including the numerous commissions of inquiry. We have then concerns around surveillance, protection of human rights defenders, of victims. There's an array of issues that have been discussed and highlighted in the different resolutions. Why I'm raising this is in 2022, 10 years after, we're now dealing with not just the human rights situation, we're also looking at the economic dimension of the crisis, of the governance crisis. And it goes to the heart of a key challenge in Sri Lanka, which is impunity. And that's something we need to address in terms of what is the next steps. And hopefully we can go into some of this, but the impunity is reflected in all these resolutions since 2012. 2014, we had the then government resolutions in Geneva. But just also to pause here, in 2009, and I wanted to raise this as well, the then government, President Mahinda Rajapaksa and the UN Secretary General came up with a joint communique a couple of weeks after the end of the war, which actually talks about accountability in Sri Lanka.